So, after the last time I was up here for pastor, Heather said I should remind people that I'm not a preacher. I used to do that every time, but I didn't do that the last time. So just a reminder, I'm not a preacher. That's right. I don't preach, don't try to preach, wasn't called to preach. I usually do expository type studies. However, I didn't get enough time to do that this time. I also usually insist on more than Sunday evening for a Wednesday evening service, but it is what it is. So I just thought we'd have a little bit of fun with this one. Just one of those topics that I always have kind of in the background, playing on video or something like that with some of these guys. Well, I got that right there. Thanks, Phil. Thanks. Also, you can shut that one off. I'll turn this on. Who knows? I may get up and just dance over here or something. You won't be able to hear me. That's right. But these guys like Ken Ham, Kent Hovind, Answers in Genesis, creation.org, things like that, it's interesting to me. It's kind of a fascinating, fun subject, and that is the age of the earth. How old is the earth? And it's kind of an interesting question in that a couple hundred years ago, nobody was asking that question. Everybody just figured it was between 6,000 and 7,000 years old. But then maybe a guy you may or may not have heard of came around with some dumb idea, Charles Darwin, and kind of messed everything up as far as that goes. Eventually came around to the Christians, became divided a bit over this question as well. And so it becomes essentially two splits. What one side is of the Christians are believe the Bible, and the other side try to cram essentially science, what the world has, the view has become on how things have been created or evolved in their sense, into the Bible. And so you have a couple of different things with that, the day-age theory and then the gap theory. So the day-age theory is that they aren't literal 24-hour days. They're ages, essentially, day age, that's the name of it. And they represent, like the Mesozoic, the Jurassic and Protozoic or whatever, those different ages basically is what they represent, which is large, obviously, periods of time, billions of years in some cases. So, and then the other one would be in the gap theory is the one where between the first day and the second day in particular, there's a massive amount of time, billions of years. So there's problems with those. Mostly the problem is with the Bible, but then there's just kind of some logical issues with that. You kind of have an issue with as far as, plants on the third day and sun on the fourth day. If you have billions of years between that, I'd assume they'd kind of wilt and die by that point, but it'd be tough to live without the sun. But so then in 1925, we had our first court battle. It was in Tennessee. Pastor will be interested to realize that. And they lost, trying to keep, at that time they were trying to keep evolution from being taught in the schools. And they determined that they couldn't keep it out. And in 1968, they went the other way with it and determined that teaching Christianity was teaching creation. It wasn't even teaching Christianity. It was just teaching creation was pushing a religion. And so they swapped. They took evolution, put it in it, and took creation out. So how many of you were taught evolution in school? Yeah. Should be most people, I think, in the group here should have had it, unless you flunked out or something. I don't know. Is that what happened, Phil? I don't remember either, but but it is interesting because that is, it is a struggle because especially with the addition of Christians who at least call themselves Christians that come up with these age and gap theories that give you a reason to go ahead and accept it and continue reading your Bible and believe in God. And a lot of people, unless they look into it and really study it, don't really understand that they don't really mesh. And so we'll look at what the Bible has to say. Let's start, very first place to start probably is in the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. All right, so we got to determine what the beginning is from that. First off, let's look at somebody who might know something about it and go to Colossians. Chapter 1, verse 16. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. Who are we talking about? Jesus. Well, God, right? But that's confirmation that that's one and the same. God and Jesus created everything. Alpha and Omega is also another description, just like, the one with according to his riches, the pastor brings out, he gives according to his riches, not out of his riches, there's no end to it. Alpha and Omega is a very similar thing in that it's basically the beginning and the end of an alphabet. How hard is it to use up a letter? Can you use up a letter? Not really. So you just, there is no end to it and to his giving. So that's Jesus, God. All right, well, let's just see what Jesus then has to say about the beginning and when the beginning was. Matthew chapter 19, verse 4. I gave the verse too early. I can't find anything in this Bible. It's all out of order. This is not my Bible. My goodness. All right, there we go. I think I got it. And he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Now, of course, he's talking about, context of this passage, he's talking about divorce. The question was asked about that. And so this is slightly out of context in that sense, but it's the truth. It doesn't matter what context it's in. He's explaining to you, giving to you what the beginning is. In the beginning made them male and female. Okay, Mark, let's get confirmation, because you always want two witnesses. That's the Bible. For doctrine, you got to have two witnesses. Mark chapter 10. Well, that's after Matthew, isn't it? Mark 10, verse 6. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. So we have confirmation. We have essentially the same thing being said there, that in the beginning it was male and female. So I don't know if you're familiar with the process, the evolution. There's actually abiogenesis and all these different, the Big Bang, the abiogenesis, and then the actual evolution of this and, things into man, okay? So you got the Big Bang, then you got life, essentially, after, so 6 billion years, and then 4 billion years, and then you have, what you have is a big rock, basically. And it rained on that rock, and then all these minerals and things come out of the rock into the rain and creates this soup. And in this soup, these chemicals get together and somehow or another create life. All right, so we have life. Interesting concept, but we have this life, and then we have, a cell. We'll figure it's the first thing, right? We got to have a cell. So how does this cell then create more cells? It splits, right? So where's this male and female in the beginning? There is not. Even if you took that meaning to be in the beginning of life or something in those respects, you can't have male and female in this. So there's no male and female in the beginning of this, no matter whether it's gap theory, day-age theory, or just who cares, we evolved theory. So far we're disagreeing with them according to the Bible. So what does the Bible then, what does it say in regard to how old is the earth? And there's a lot of ways to determine this. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Verses 21 and 22. For since by man came death, by man came also... Whoops. Did I go too far? I did. Actually, I skipped something. Okay. That's all right. We'll leave it there because we'll get to that one as well. It's these glasses, I think, with the bifocal things throwing me off. So anyway, all passages point to being 6,000 years. We saw the one from Jesus talking about the beginning, and then everything else goes to that as well. So all righteous blood of this generation shall be required from Abel to Zacharias. That is indicating right there that our first dead was Abel until this point where this statement was made in the Bible of Zacharias. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 21 and 22, we can actually go ahead and read that now. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. So by man came death. So if you didn't, one more verse, Romans chapter 5. Keep your place on verse chapter 15 of Corinthians, because we'll just flip right back to that. But Romans 5, verse 12. Wherefore, as by one man's sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So in these two passages, the one in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, and in Romans, we're seeing that death was brought by man, and death was by sin, or because of sin. So prior to sin, prior to man, you had no death in the world. So you'd be stacking live things pretty high by the time you got billions of years into where man is, waiting patiently to die until sin entered the world, if it was billions of years. So how do you get to 6,000? If we go back, flip back over there to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last man, Adam, made a quickening spirit. So the first man is Adam. So that's where you start. That's your start time, okay? And then you've got quite a few genealogies in the Bible. In Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, you have a couple of genealogies there that are really helpful. Just as kind of a side note on that, and we went over this. We did a little bit of a study on Matthew for a little while in our Sunday morning Bible study class, and discovered that people are always looking for contradictions, of course, and that's one of them, because they're obviously, clearly not the same genealogies. It's not the same lineup at all. But when you look a little bit closer, what you have is in Matthew, it's the genealogy of Mary, and in Luke, it's the genealogy of Joseph. Yes, thank you. So, and that's important because you needed both, really, because you had a bloodline. You didn't need them, but I mean it was more significant in that you had a bloodline, which was through Mary, which we know Joseph was the stepdad, so there was no bloodline there. But so you establish a bloodline all the way to David. It actually goes to Abraham, I believe, in that one. But through David, that's the important one. And then Joseph in Luke is in those days stepfather. The heritage, the inheritance, still applied through step family. So the kingly heritage that he would inherit as well comes through Joseph, even though he wasn't his father, his actual father. And also both went to David. So no contradiction there, but in any case, it gives you a great lineup of people down the line, and then you've got to just find the years that those people were alive to help with that. Some difficulties of the timeline, there definitely are some, but let's see, starting with Adam, we have, it's actually pretty clear, pretty easy. Adam's 130 years. At 130 years old, he begat Seth. Seth, at 105 years old, begat Enos. And at 90 years, Enos begat Canaan. So you have a pretty good start and very clear establishment of some times there. Where it gets a little bit difficult in Kings, because you're getting now out of the begats and you're into just, okay, how long did they reign? Well, sometimes you got some overlapping reigns. You got, for instance, David and Solomon. They were both kings during X period of time, but they were both alive and king during an overlapping period. So to establish that, you always use the New Testament. Helps a lot to they actually say things like 350 years of kings, so that helps, and can at least justify a lot of those timelines in there. But then you also have the son of, and that makes things a little bit difficult because Jesus was the son of David, right? So there was a relative, a direct descendant frequently. Yeah, they refer to him as the son of or the father of, and they aren't really that directly related, timeline-wise. It's not their father or their son. Then the other thing is the begats, and there are quite a few of those, and people have sifted through them and looking for those timelines and stuff, and God bless them, because that is a tough read right there. I mean, they could separate that out into its own little book and just let me go through. I could go start to back on the Bible several times before. Okay, now I'll go look at the begats, but anyway. But the problem with the begats is, were they born? It was a begat, a born, was a begat, a conceived, was a begat, a year old. Year old was kind of like the standard. If they lived to a year, we'll go ahead and count them, sort of a thing at that time. So So you have just some variations, some slight variations. Nothing big, nothing major. Not a billion years in there. There's not a begat was a billion years or anything, but there are a few years in there that are a little bit harder to track down. And then obviously the fact that how we measure our dates, right? How do we measure our dates? Christ's birth is how we essentially measure it. We have the Anno Domini, or the AD, which is Year of the Lord, which is, one side of that, one half, or not half, but one side of it, and then of course before Christ was before that. And of course that's obviously not 100% right out of the gate. It's not, because it didn't start year 0, it started year 1. So we're at least in 2019 right now. This is 2019. I probably wouldn't put it on a check, but it is definitely a year later than before Christ. So, and then actually there's some experts that believe he was born to, let's see, how many years? 2, 4, or 6 years BC. Of course, he couldn't have been born before Christ, but you know what I'm saying. 2, 4, 6 years earlier. So, and then also you have the Hebrew calendar, which was 360 days, whereas our calendar is 365 and a quarter days, or whatever that is. And, that's an interesting thing too. And of course, numbers in general, I think, are very important in God's Word and how He does things. But 360, if you can think of some other things that are 360, and actually that could very well have been how many days there were originally in a year. So, and you didn't need the quarter in there at the time either. So, anyway, that's like a pastor rabbit hole almost. But and then so then closing some of the gaps. So there's some other things in there. Noah was the 8th person. So you have essentially 8 generations, not generations, actually 8 people in a line between Adam and Noah. So there are some good, really solid ways of narrowing this down to a pretty decent number. Again, I think I said at the beginning, it's kind of between 6,000 and 7,000 years, definitely leaning much more toward the 6,000 years. And, it's impossible to give an exact figure, though some have tried. For instance, there was a guy, a monk way back, that actually poured through all the begats and did everything. Just went through fine-tooth comb. He said that the beginning was 4004 BC. That was Genesis 1:1. And Scofield Bible, if you happen to have a Scofield reference Bible, says 4004 BC based on that study. So, that was Genesis 1:1, 4004 BC, according to Scofield. Yeah, he has the gap theory in there. He does. That is kind of interesting now that you mention that. Yes. Yeah. Very much. But you got Abraham, 2000 BC. You got, like I say, some known things. Plus 400 years of slavery after that. Moses at 1400 BC. 350 years of Judges. David, 1,000-year BC was David's reign. 721 BC, Judah taken captive. Approximately 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes Israel. Then they get back the land under Roman control prior to Christ's birth. So pretty good figures in there, really. So then, what you can show the Bible says that, right? But then they make it sound like everything you say is crazy or way out there. There's no way you could. How about this one? Anybody ever hear? Who did Adam's sons marry? Never hear that question. How ludicrous! How could you possibly believe something like that? And And then, of course, God done it, right? Everything that is unexplainable is God. But, they figure you're using that as an excuse. Anytime you run into a wall, you can't figure it out, you don't know what it is, you say God done it. So it's the point is to make you feel ridiculous. Well, let's look at it. Genesis 4, chapter 4, verse 16 and 17. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east side of Eden, or of east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So one of the things, I guess, is where did he find that wife? He found her there in Nod. No, he knew his wife there, and they conceived. That was not, he didn't meet her there. He already had a wife getting there. So, all right, so ridiculous as it sounds, let's compare notes a little bit. Let's just compare what is ridiculous. So 14 billion years ago, Big Bang. Okay, that was a dot. About that, not even that big, you couldn't see it. It was a dot. Contained all the matter and all the energy and all the heat that we have in our entire universe. A dot that you couldn't even see. And it blew up. Not sure where the dot came from, not sure why it blew up. Well, I do know why it blew up, because it had a lot of energy and some heat in that thing. Okay. And then 5 billion years later, the earth cooled. Then 4 billion years later, we got life. That was that rock that turned into your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And then 2.5 million years ago, I believe it is, not from that, but 2.5 million years ago, we had man. Man evolved from that rock that we had there. Creation says we were, the earth was created 6,000 years ago. Then we had the flood at 4,400 years ago, Jesus at 01, and today, 2018. From their timeline, essentially the same sort of a thing. Big Bang, earth forming, life starting, and then today. The textbooks call this life and how life occurred. It appeared, or it formed. Those are not scientific terms, in case you didn't realize that. Those are religious statements. There's one textbook has this, a direct quote: process from a complex chemical soup to a living organism is very slow. I would say, or just didn't happen, something along that. This is a university textbook. The first self-replicating systems must have emerged in this organic soup. Must have. Good guess. No, I must have done something, I think. So then you look at it just from a logical standpoint. Well, you have that cell, right, that split. Why did it go from that to from an asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction and reproduction at all? Why would it do that? Why would evolution take you down that path? I would, first of all, I think splitting a cell would be easier. Splitting would be easier. Should have continued that. We could split in half and make another me. Or even better. I see why we didn't want that, John. Even better than that, though, why wouldn't you want to evolve into just living forever? Why would reproduction be the goal? In any case, man emerged. Again, another non-scientific term used in textbooks. Man emerged. How's any of this science? I don't know. Francisco Redi, Louis Pasteur are two people, pretty famous. Probably most of you know who those guys were. You drink the one guy's milk every day, probably. That proves spontaneous generation is wrong 150 years ago. It's impossible. Literally impossible. You have a theory of evolution, but you have the impossibility of spontaneous generation. So how do you get there? And then, again, the ridiculous statement was, who did Adam's sons marry? Who did the first cell marry? I think we have, should be pretty close to this one. Genesis 5, verse 4. In the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. So that's a total of 930 years, my calculation there. So he was alive for a long time. He probably had a lot of children, right? So obviously the answer is they married their sisters. There's reasons for that. First of all, there was no choice. Those were the first people. Those were the only people. Secondly, there was no CPS at the time, no Child Protective Service to tell them that they couldn't do that. There was, right. There was no stigma to it was probably the big one, right? Because there wasn't anyone, there was the law, Moses didn't bring the law until 1500 BC, which included no marrying your sister. There were no defects is the point. There were no defects. Everything was perfect. You got to understand one thing too. Adam married his rib. So marrying your sister is distant compared to what we started with. So there's no defects, and we inherit everything. So they inherited no defects. The defects come far later, probably somewhere around 1500 BC would be my guess. We inherit everything from our parents. I mean, we even inherit having children from our parents. If they didn't have any, you wouldn't have that ability either. But billions of genes, literally billions of genes that we have, approximately 3,500 are defective in the gene pool, in each individual's gene pool. So when you're just marrying somebody who's not a close relative, the odds of them lining up out of the billions they're slim. It happens. That's how you get deformities in birth. But it's rare. But if you're a close relative, those defective genes are going to be in a pretty similar area. So you're much more likely to get deformities and other issues, health issues and stuff. Anemia is real big with incest and things like that. And every state has a law about marrying close relatives. There are 3 or 4 of them that still allow you to marry your first cousin, but probably not recommended still. I don't know if Tennessee's one of them or not. So, all right, how many of you knew your grandparents, knew or know your grandparents? How many of you knew or know your great-grandparents? Wow, that's quite a bit. How about great-great-grandparents? Oh, yeah. No, that's what I'm thinking. But his great-grandfather did meet Noah, his great-great-grandson. So there was that. So that goes back quite a ways. All right. So Adam lived long enough to know Lamech, which was Noah's father. This is an interesting thing if you look at it on a chart. This is really kind of fascinating. There's a 56-year overlap between Adam and Noah's father. Noah would have known, or could have known, his granddad Methuselah. His great-granddad, probably not, because that was Enoch, and he went for a walk with God and didn't come back. He could have known his great-great-grandfather Jared, his great-great-great-grandfather Mahalalel, his great-great-great-great-grandfather Canaan, and his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Enos. So the point is, these people lived a very long time. This was another part of that, actually, the issue of how ridiculous things are, and how could this possibly, the story of creation, get from 4,000 years before Christ. I think there's not too many people have a concern with. There's a lot of written word in the secular world, history and so forth, from Jesus' time forward. But from the time of creation to that point, there's very little written word, although there's no reason to believe that they didn't have it. They do often claim that it could only have been verbal history, but that's not entirely true. Okay, so people claim no way to pass along this story. Well, Adam overlapped Methuselah by several hundred years. Methuselah and Shem overlapped 100 years. Shem lived many years after the flood, could have known Abraham, Isaac, and possibly even Jacob. So you're talking about, in 2,000 years, 4 people that would have been eyewitnesses of those periods of time all the way back to creation. How many people I'm just thinking, I've got dad, grandfather, I'm not making it to my great-grandfather, but his great-grandfather did. So you could have had those people, 4 people, pass along a story pretty easily anyway. So it's not ridiculous by any stretch. These are the generations, all of which are eyewitnesses. I'm going to skip that part just because we're about ready to close here. But so the point was, too, as a person gets older, that's interesting, but well, I'm just ever notice with some older people, their ears get really long, their noses get bigger. Sometimes their foreheads get a little bit. What that is actually gets thicker. They get a thicker skull. I don't mean to. They get thick-headed. I'm sorry. It's science. It's called acromegaly. Acromegaly. That's a secretion of hormones, excess hormones. And in the book Buried Alive, Jack Kuzo discusses this, that cavemen, Neanderthals, with that prominent brow that was supposedly separated us from them from what we have now as human beings, is actually people that live several hundred years old. So these are the people that we're talking about here. Most likely are those Neanderthal, and they weren't stupid. They had bigger brains than we do. They lived several hundred years old. They had learned a few things. All right, so we're just going to sum it up here. Evolutionists, whether claiming to be Christian or not, are calling Jesus either a liar or ignorant, as we saw in Matthew 19:4. At the beginning, made them male and female. So that's Jesus. You're calling him a liar, or you're saying he doesn't know, one of the two. When we know he's God, he created everything. So you're calling him a liar is essentially what you're saying. If claim to be Christian or not, doesn't matter. There is a whole lot more, and it's fun stuff, but that's all right. We'll close her up from there. And you know, it's what's interesting, I think, mostly about it too. Why I like it a lot is not so much that these Christian Science folks. Look, as far as the way they define science, science is defined by can it be tested and disproven. It's not whether it can be proven; it's can it be tested and disproven. So you can't disprove God. It's not possible. First of all, we know because he's real, but I mean, in a lab that can't happen. So they can't test them, so they don't consider it science. I don't care what you call it. I'm going to call it science just because I got no other word. These people have come up with answers to what we see in nature, and they attribute to billions of years old. And they give you a very logical, very simple answer and explanation for what we're seeing as being creation. The flood generally is involved with that quite a bit. So it makes no difference whether or not, it doesn't prove God. I'm not suggesting that it does, but it just gives you an answer. It gives you peace of mind. I say, when somebody's asking you a question, they're usually not questioning you because they want an answer. They're questioning you because they just want to point out you're an idiot and they know more than you do. And so it's not about them. I don't look for the answers to answer somebody. I look for the answers for a little bit of comfort and a little bit more, to strengthen my faith in things like that. So very interesting. A lot of resources out there if you want to continue on with that. But anyways, that's it. We hit 8 o'clock right on the button, so we'll close with a word of prayer.